My name is Jennifer Emanuel, fur bearer biologist.
My name is Tanya Sturman. I'm the program manager for the Fur and Alligator Advisory Councils.
And we work for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries.
And this video is to help you prepare for testing at the Louisiana Envirothon Wildlife Station. So we're going to look at some pelts and skins of some common Louisiana animals. And we're going to identify the best recognition factors, or BRF. Those are the characteristics that will help you identify each individual pelt. I'm going to start with the easiest ones, the ones with the most distinctive characteristics, and work our way down to some that have some overlapping characteristics, and I'll point out some of the finer features to help you distinguish between those species. So just looking at the table here, we have two large pelts. We have a large black one and a large tan one, or fawn-colored one. So the large black one is the Louisiana black bear. It has pretty coarse skin. You can see some brownish hues within the skin. So some of the pelts from the black bear will have a lot more of that brownish hue. It has a little tail here. This particular one has a paw with the claws on it. So a large black pelt is the Louisiana black bear. All right. So the large tan pelt, or fawn-colored pelt, is the white-tailed deer. So this has pretty short hair, and if you look at the tail, you can see that flick of white under the tail. Okay. So next we'll look at some pelts and skins that have very distinctive markings. Most everyone recognizes this right off as a skunk. This is a striped skunk. This particular one has kind of your classic Disney coloration. You got the little line up the nose, you know, the white at the back of the head. It splits down the back, and then some white running on into the tail. But the striped skunk has a lot of color variations. I've seen some that have been almost completely white. This one's almost completely black. So you got the little bit on the top of his head and the little bit around the nose. But they're still pretty easy to identify. They're going to be black and white, kind of your same basic body shape for the skunk. All right. We'll move on to another omnivore in Louisiana. So this is an animal that, you know, eats both meat and vegetation. The BRF for this one is it has this striped tail and a mask around its eyes. So this is the raccoon. And the raccoon has some color variations in the skin. This one has is more of a silver look, so black and silver, a little white. This one has more of a bronzy look, but still it has the nice stripes on the tail and the mask around its eyes. Now you may run across some pelts where the tails have been, you know, torn off from too much handling. You're still going to see the mask around the eyes as a BRF. All right. This is another Louisiana omnivore, the distinctive coloration. It has a white face, kind of a pointy nose, some silver in its back. The underfur is white. And if you notice it, this pelt doesn't have a tail. Now the animal has a tail, but the tail doesn't have fur, so when they pelt it out and tan the fur, it doesn't include the tail. This is the opossum. All right. We're going to move on to some of the carnivores. You may recognize this as a cat, and the cats have kind of a shorter face. Here's the ears, there's the nose. This cat generally has a white on the belly with the spots. This particular one has the spots running around its flanks and on its back. A lot of them won't have the spots as noticeable on the back, but just have kind of this tabby cat pattern. The BRF for this particular cat species is the short tail, or the bobbed tail. This is a bobcat. So the next three species we're going to look at are canines. And the BRFs between these, I mean, the first one is we have one large one, and we have two smaller ones. The large one is a coyote. It's the bushy tail. The canines all have a long nose because the sense of smell is very important to them. Our wild canines all have pointy ears. The coyotes, the color can vary, can be black, gray. This one has a lot of yellow and rust in its fur. And the two smaller ones are foxes. We got the gray fox and the red fox. So the gray fox has gray on its back, a little bit of white under its chin, and it has this rusty brown color on its shoulders, around its ears, down its front legs. It's got a little coarser, shorter hair than the red fox. The red fox is one of our softest furs. And it's got this kind of golden red fur, you know, on the back. It'll have also a little white on its chin. And one of the distinctive features of the red fox is the tip of white on its tail. But as you can see, it's not always that obvious. This one has just a little bit of white that's kind of covered up with the black. We'll move on to the animals that live kind of in and around the water. And if you notice, like the opossum, these three also don't have tails on the pelts. Again, the animals have tails, but the tails don't have furs. And the BRFs for these would be small, medium, and large. So we'll start with the large one. This is the beaver. The beaver has a really lush, thick underfur, and then it has these long guard hairs that helps it shed water. Another BRF for the beaver, if it's a traditional tan and cut, is that it's tanned open, which means it has the fur on one side. If you flip it over, it has leather on the other. The other two rodents are tanned cased, so it has fur all the way around, and you have to turn it inside out like a sock to see the leather on the inside. So then we'll look at the smallest of the rodents. This is a muskrat, and there's quite a bit of color variation in the muskrat. This one is black with more of a grayish. This one has more brown with some rusty oranges in it. They all have this kind of bullet-like shape. The muskrat was the star of the Louisiana fur market in the early 1900s, which brings us to our medium-sized or middle-sized rodent, which is a non-native species and was brought here because of its similarity to the other two rodents. It has fur similar to the beaver, a nice underfur, these long guard hairs that helps it shed its water. Its coloration is more even than the muskrat, which made it more valuable in the fur market. And it thrives in the same habitat that the muskrat lives in, which is coastal Louisiana marshes. This is the nutria. Okay, our next two animals that live in and around the water look very similar, and that's because they are in the same family, except for size. We've got the small one and a large one. So they have a long, thin body, relatively long tail. They are both carnivores. The big one is the river otter, and the small one is the mink. So those are all of our mammals that I'm going to show you. Then we have some reptile skins. So these are all alligator skins. Obviously, it's not the natural color. The first step in the tanning process removes the outer layer of the skin, which has all the color pigmentation. So this is what it looks like after it's first tanned. And then they color it back any color you want. I've seen purple, pink, blue. So alligator skins can be any color, so color is not a BRF, but you will see that they have scales. These two are a belly cut. So you have the belly, you have the flank, which are these smaller, rounder scales, and this one you can still see a little bit of the back scales on the side. And this is a back cut. So alligators have built-in body armor. Every scale here has a bony ossification that we call a scute in it that protects them. So they have the bigger ones up here on their neck area, and they have these little ones all the way through the back and down the tail. So in this one you can see the back, and then you have the flank, which the more rounded oval shaped scales, and then the belly was split in half, and it's more the rectangular scales.
Today we're going to talk about skulls and tracks. You can really learn a lot about an animal by looking at the skull and looking at the footprints. Details such as what it eats, where it lives, and the kind of role it fills within each environment. So the two animals we have here first are our two hoofed animals that live here in Louisiana. So the largest skull that we have here is the feral hog. And you can tell it's a feral hog because of the large size of the skull, this big swooping forehead. So it has these two orbital sockets that are set far back and slightly to the side. So feral hogs are traditionally a prey species. So it has eyes set back into the side so that it has a wider field of vision. It has these two sets of tusks on the upper and lower jaw. These are modified canines. And a feral hog can use these teeth to help dig in the ground for plants and shoots and roots, which are two things that it really likes to eat. So feral hogs are primarily herbivore, but they could be considered omnivore. They eat a wide variety of things, depending on what they can find in their environment. They have a large variety of teeth, so they have the modified canines, these large incisors that they can use to clip vegetation or dig in the ground, premolars, and molars that can be used for grinding vegetation. This one here is the white-tailed deer. So much like the feral hog, the orbitals are set back into the side, so this animal has a wider field of vision. Unlike the feral hog, the white-tailed deer does not have any canines. It just has the incisors in the front to clip vegetation and molars that are used for grinding that vegetation. And we have two skulls here because we wanted to show an example of sexual dimorphism. In fact, it is the only skull that we have that does show those characteristics. So this one here without the antlers is the female, or the doe, and you'll notice it has a very smooth skull. The one next to it is the male deer, and they have these peduncles that grow out of the top of the skull, and seasonally, when they get into breeding season, they will grow these antlers, which they will then shed at the end of the season. But they will maintain these knots on the top of their skull year-round. And this track is for the white-tailed deer. So again, I mentioned that these two are our hoofed animals. So you'll see the two large toes, and when you see the tracks out in the field, this is the kind of thing that you would look for, the two large toes pressed into the dirt. Our next group of animals are the members of the rodent family. So these are common mammals that you'll find in coastal Louisiana, but you'll find them pretty much in any waterway within the state. So you'll notice immediately all three of these animals have common characteristics. All three have these large incisors that are colored slightly orange. These are used for clipping and digging up vegetation. All of them will have these flat molars for grinding vegetation. All three of these species are herbivores. You'll also notice that the eye sockets are set in the center of the skull, and they're actually oriented on the top of the head. All three of these animals live in the water, so the orientation of the eyes allows the animal to see where they're going while they're swimming. The largest of the three skulls is the beaver. In front of the skull, we have the beaver tracks. So you'll notice that the hind track is much larger than their forefoot. So again, this animal lives in the water, so the large paddle-like webbed hind foot allows the animal to propel itself through the water, while the smaller foot allows the animal to pick up and move and manipulate vegetation that it's snacking on. The one in the center looks very much like the beaver skull, but this is actually our invasive species, the nutria. You'll notice that it is roughly about half the size of the beaver, but it contains a lot of the same characteristics of the beaver, with the large incisors and the molars used for grinding vegetation. The smallest one of the three is the muskrat. Again, you'll see the eye sockets on the top of the head, the large incisors, and the teeth used for grinding. In front of the skull, we have the track of the muskrat. Looks very similar to the beaver, with the larger hind foot used for propelling the animal through the water, and the smaller foot used for digging up vegetation and finding food. So the next one I'm going to talk about here is probably the most unusual of the mammals on the table. This is the nine-banded armadillo. So you'll notice immediately that this animal is a homodont, meaning that it has all teeth that are all the same shape, all used for the same purpose. So the skull itself looks pretty much like most other mammals until you put the plate on the top. So this is an armored animal. You'll notice that its eyes are set pretty far back into the side. Again, this gives the animal a wider field of vision. So now we're moving into the order Carnivora. So even though these are all in the order of Carnivora, some of these animals eat primarily meat, and some are more omnivores, eating a variety of animal species as well as plant species. These two on the table are both piscivores, meaning that they eat primarily fish. So the smaller one on the table is the American mink. You'll notice that the orbitals are set high on the head. So just like the beaver, the nutria, and the muskrat, this animal is primarily living in the water. So the eyes are set high on the head that allow the animal to see while it's swimming. This animal has large canines and teeth that are used for shredding and grinding up bones. This one next to it, the larger of the two, is the North American river otter. So much like the mink, this animal has large canines and a variety of molars that are used for shredding and grinding and breaking up bones, with the eyes set pretty high on the head. And these are the tracks for the river otter. Again, like the beaver and the nutria and the muskrat, the otter has webbed behind feet to help it move through the water. And much like the otter, the mink also has webbed feet. Next, we have the striped skunk. This animal, even though it is a member of the order Carnivora, is an omnivore. So it has large canines, as well as teeth that serve a variety of purpose of breaking up insects, any kind of prey species it finds, as well as plant matter. The eyes are set towards the center of the head, giving the animal a wider field of vision. And the skunk has a prominent crest on the back of its skull. The tracks of the skunk are very different than the animals that live on the water. So you'll notice the skunk does not have feet adapted for living on the water. It has a larger hind foot and a smaller forefoot, complete with claws that will show in the dirt. The next skull we have is the bobcat. You'll notice immediately how round the shape of this skull is and how short the rostrum is. So this animal primarily hunts by sight, so it has these large eye sockets that are set very far forward in the skull, allowing the animal to sight out its prey. This animal is purely carnivore, does not eat any vegetation, so it has these large canines for catching and grasping and holding prey, and then molars that are all very sharp, used for slicing and shredding meat. The tracks for the bobcat will look just like any other cat. They have retractable claws, so when you see the tracks out in the fields, no claws will show. Next up, we have our opossum and our raccoon. These are of similar size, so I wanted to make sure I pointed out the two main differences of these skulls. Opossums have this very prominent sagittal crest, whereas the raccoon does not. Raccoon also has this larger brain cavity than the opossum. So both these animals have eye sockets that are set forward, so they can sight out their prey. Both of these species are omnivores. So this on the raccoon, you can see they have large canines, sharp premolars, and then flattened molars that allow it to grind up nuts and seeds it might be eating. On the opossum, you'll notice also the large canines, the incisors in the front, as well as a variety of molars, sharpened premolars and then flattened back molars to allow it to eat its variety of prey. The raccoon has these very prominent fingers on its front foot. They use these feet to grasp and find and dig up food sources. So when you see the tracks out in the field, you'll see the long, prominent, thin fingers. The opossum is North America's only marsupial. So they're primarily living in trees, climbing in trees, so they have back feet that are very well adapted for that environment. So the back foot has the separated digit that allows it to grasp tree branches. So lastly, I'm going to talk about our 3 canid species and our 1 bear species. So I'm going to start out by talking about the coyote. So if you think back to the bobcat that I showed you, which had a very short nose and very large eye sockets, the coyote has much smaller eye sockets and a much larger rostrum. So this animal primarily uses its nose to find food. Coyotes are omnivores, so they have a large canines, sharpened premolars, and molars that are flattened towards the back so that they can eat a variety of foods. You'll also notice the rounded jaw, which will help distinguish it from the gray fox. So here are 2 fox species. They're very similar to the coyote with eyes that are forward-facing and long rostrums that allow it to sniff out food sources. Both have canines, sharpened premolars, and flattened molars that allow them to eat a variety of food. So you'll notice on the gray fox, it has a flattened jaw, whereas on the red fox, it has a more curved jaw. You'll also notice the shape of this crest on the top of the skull differs between the 2 species, with the red fox having a crest that thins towards the base of the skull, and a gray fox that remains more U-shaped towards the base of the skull. Now the tracks for the coyote and the fox are what you would expect with any canine. They have 4 toes, a paw pad, and prominent claws that will show up when they step. And this one here is our Louisiana black bear. It's also a member of the carnivora family, though it is an omnivore. It has large canines and incisors, as well as sharpened premolars and molars that flatten towards the back. It allows this animal to eat a variety of food. It has large eye sockets that are forward-facing to allow it to sight on potential food sources. The track for the black bear, as you would expect with an animal this large, is very large in size, almost the size of a human hand. They have a large paw pad, 5 digits, and prominent claws that will show up when it steps. And lastly, we have our North American alligator skull. You'll notice this skull is very different from the mammals on the table. It has this kind of pockmarked appearance that helps the skull be less weight, less heavy. The teeth on the alligator, this is a homodont, so it has teeth that are all of similar shape and all used for the same purpose. Alligators are carnivores, so they eat entirely meat that they've scavenged. They use these teeth to grab prey and to shred that prey. The eye sockets are set far back and are entirely on top of the head. This animal lives in the water, so this orientation of the eye sockets allows this animal to see while it's submerged in the water.